The new intern accidentally damaged the millionaire's pants, and what happened next surprised everyone. Before we dive into the story, please leave a comment about which city you're watching from, and don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Julia was holding her coffee cup carefully, like it was something very special. She took a deep breath, looked around, and thought, okay, coffee secured. Now I just need to get out of here without making a scene. She took 2 steps, but on the 3rd step, Destiny decided to play a trick. Her heel got caught on the edge of the carpet, and suddenly the world spun. The cup shook in her hand, and her heart raced. In a quick moment, she reached out for something to hold on to. Unfortunately, she ended up grabbing a man's pants. The sound of the button popping was loud, and within moments the pants dropped right to the man's ankles. When she looked, she saw her fingers clutching the waistband. She blinked in shock. There was Dylan Carter, the CEO, looking both powerful and very surprised, now without his pants. "What are you doing, you crazy woman?" Dylan shouted, stepping back and trying to cover himself. The room fell silent. One employee dropped a cookie she was eating, another intern crossed himself, and someone quietly whispered, "Oh no." Julia was still holding onto the waistband, wide-eyed and trembling. Her coffee shook in her other hand. "Too tripped," she stuttered, her voice high-pitched. "It was the carpet. I swear I didn't mean to. I didn't even know it was pants." "And what did you think it was?" Dylan yelled, struggling to pull his pants back up, looking both angry and confused. "A curtain," Julia replied quickly. As she stumbled back, she lost her balance and nearly fell right on top of him. "Oh no, let go, please." Dylan hopped back, pants still down, trying to regain his dignity. She finally let go of the waistband like it was on fire. "Oh my gosh, I didn't mean to. I'm just clumsy." "Really clumsy?" he replied, his face red. "I'm standing here in the office like this." He bent down quickly to pull his pants up. Julia tried to hide behind her coffee cup, but there was no way to hide now that everyone was watching. One of the younger lawyers whispered, "This definitely breaks some kind of dress code." The head of HR walked by, saw the scene, and tiredly muttered, "I think you'll pretend this is a shared dream." Dylan finally got his pants fixed, tightened his belt, and walked over to Julia with a sarcastic smile. "Let me get this straight. You walk in here, pull my pants down in front of 20 people, and think you can just leave with an apology and a coffee?" She stammered, nearly tripping over her words. "I'm Julia, Dr. Michael's intern. I just wanted coffee." "And you ended up causing chaos," he replied, amused. "You're like a walking disaster with a badge." Everyone was trying to hold back laughter, but one of the analysts couldn't take it and burst out laughing, nearly choking on his coffee. "Two can clean the carpet or buy you new pants." "I have $18, Julia said in a panic. "Oh, great. So if I have an event this week, he'll just buy used jeans from a flea market," he joked, shaking his head. "Problem solved," Dylan said with a laugh. Julia took a step back but tripped on the corner of the carpet and almost fell again. This time, she managed to hold on to her dignity barely. Dylan crossed his arms and finished, "Welcome to the office, Julia. You did in 2 minutes what no one else could in 2 years," leaving everyone speechless and almost breathless from laughing. She shook her head, feeling lost. "I might quit. I can't live with this," she said, covering her face. "Relax, your reputation is fine. You'll get used to it," he chuckled. And at that moment, Julia was sure of 2 things. First, she didn't know how she was still alive. Second, this was officially the worst first day of an internship, or maybe the best start to something unexpected. If Julia thought the coffee room mishap was behind her, she was wrong. The next morning, she tried her best to go unnoticed. She walked as if she were part of the furniture, avoiding stares and looking at the floor while holding a folder like a shield against the world. But the world had a name, and that name was Dylan. Well, look who's here, the pants destroyer." His unmistakable voice rang through the hallway just as she thought she might escape unnoticed. Julia squinted, pretending she hadn't heard. She quickened her pace. "Hey, hold on there, intern," he said, catching up with that half-teasing, half-charming smile. "Are you running away from me?" She took a deep breath, gripped her badge, and turned around, trying to keep her dignity. "Me? Run away? Of course not. I'm just focused," she replied, straightening her blazer even though it looked fine. Dylan crossed his arms, tilted his head, and looked at her like a puzzle. "Focused, huh? Just be careful not to focus so hard that you accidentally tear someone's jacket today." "Very funny," she rolled her eyes, holding back more words. "Don't worry, your pants are safe for today," he replied, tapping his chin as if deep in thought. "Maybe I should get suspenders just to be safe." Just then, hurried footsteps interrupted them. Michael appeared, carrying a stack of folders. He saw the scene and grinned. "Here he comes," Michael said, shifting his gaze between Julia and Dylan. "Careful, Julia. I heard when his pants fell, his ego followed." Julia couldn't help but laugh. Dylan raised an eyebrow, pretending to be offended. "Very funny, Michael, seriously." Then he turned to Julia. "See, I'm the victim here." She smiled, adjusting the papers in her hands. "If you'd like, I could start a fundraiser to buy you a stronger belt. We could even set up warning cones around the office to protect you from those tricky rugs." Dylan crossed his arms, clearly amused. Michael shook his head, trying not to laugh. "You two are like a walking sitcom." "No," Dylan replied. "I'm the victim in this. She's the bringer of chaos." Julia smirked. "Chaos? Me? I'm all about peace and quiet." He laughed a short laugh. "You've got the subtlety of a hurricane." She put her hands on her hips and stared at him. "And you've got an ego the size of this building. I'd say we're even." They stared at each other for a moment, as if engaging in a competition. Michael stepped in and gave them both a light pat on the shoulder. "All right, let's get to work before the boss shows up and we're all in trouble." He paused, realizing his choice of words, and quickly added, "Well, probably best not to use the word trouble right now." Dylan shook his head, amused, and walked down the hall. But he couldn't resist one last comment. "Be careful, Julia. I'm watching you. Rugs, chairs, ties, everything's a risk." Julia crossed her arms and quickly responded, "That's fine. I'm watching you too, especially your pants." Dylan's smile grew wider. For a moment, it felt more than just playful teasing. Something deeper was there. Julia took a deep breath, shook her head, and followed Michael into the office. Once the door shut, she asked, "Seriously, Michael, is this normal? Is he always like this?" Michael set down some folders, pulled out his chair, and said, "Well, only when someone does something unforgettable, like when he embarrassed himself in front of everyone." Julia buried her face in her hands, feeling embarrassed. "I'm going to be remembered for that forever, right?" "Oh, definitely," he chuckled. "But honestly, I think he had it coming. Dylan thinks the world revolves around him." Michael smiled at her. "You were like a storm he never saw coming." Julia took a deep breath, organized the papers on the table, and smiled back. "Well, he better get ready. This storm has a name, Julia." In the next office, Dylan adjusted his tie and looked out the window, a different smile on his face. "Julia," he murmured, almost without realizing it. At that moment, he knew she was impossible to ignore. The following days followed a familiar pattern. Whenever Julia thought she could enjoy some peace, Dylan would show up with a joke, a sarcastic comment, or that tease in his smile she was starting to recognize. But that morning, the vibe in the office felt different. The sounds of hurried footsteps, urgent phone calls, and low conversations filled the air with tension. Even the usual coffee smell seemed off. Julia straightened the papers on Michael's desk and saw that he looked serious. "Did something happen?" she asked, worried. Michael sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Oh, something definitely happened. The office is in trouble." Not literally, but almost. Before she could ask more, the conference room door swung open. Dylan walked in, looking sharp but clearly unhappy. "This is ridiculous," he said, pacing. "I've managed this client for years, and now this." Right behind him came the firm's managing partner, Mr. Benson, a man who spoke little but made sure everyone listened. "Dylan," Mr. Benson said steadily, "the client was clear. He doesn't want you on the case anymore." Dylan looked shocked. "That makes no sense. I know that contract inside and out." Mr. Benson crossed his arms. "Exactly, and yet you missed a detail that cost us the client's trust." Julia and Michael exchanged glances. "This sounds serious," she whispered. Michael nodded. "That's because it is." The partner continued, laying out the facts. "The client wants a new attorney to handle the case from now on." Dylan paused and looked directly at Michael. "Is that you, Michael?" He stood still in surprise. "You heard me. The case is yours now. Make sure to put your own team together." Michael took a deep breath, surprised but nodded. "Understood, sir. I'll handle it." The partner nodded and left the room, leaving a heavy silence behind. Dylan needed a moment to think. When he turned around, he saw Julia standing there, looking surprised and a bit uncomfortable, holding a folder tightly. "No," he said, shaking his head while rubbing his chin. "This isn't happening." Michael, half smiling, patted Julia on the back. "Oh, it's happening, Julia. You're officially on the team now." Her eyes widened. Really? He confirmed, I need someone organized and not afraid to handle tough situations. Dylan crossed his arms and looked at them both. Oh, sure, because hiring the woman who once had a minor mishap in the office is such a great idea. Julia took a breath, straightened her blazer, and replied confidently, Don't worry. In this case, I plan to present strong arguments. Michael stifled a laugh, enjoying her response. Dylan, however, looked frustrated. This is crazy. I've been working on this case for months, and you think you can just come in and fix everything? Michael, staying calm, replied, Actually, that's exactly what we're going to do. Julia tried not to smile, finding it amusing to see Dylan, usually so confident, lose his cool. Oh, and by the way, Michael added, the client wants to keep your name off the case, so Dylan, stay out of it. Dylan took a sharp breath, his jaw tight. Great, perfect. He turned to Julia. Just so you know, he said, pointing at her and then at Michael, this won't end well. Julia stood firm and replied, For me, it's already off to a great start. Dylan blinked, caught off guard and at a loss for words, a rare moment indeed. Well, if you'll excuse me, he said, straightening his tie and trying to look in control. I have better things to do than watch this unfold. He walked out confidently but paused at the door to add, Just try not to let your pride get in the way. Julia smiled calmly. Don't worry, and you should be mindful of your own pride too. Michael, already seated at his desk, shook his head, thinking that this was going to be an interesting journey ahead. Little did they know, this case would change everything in their lives. The office was buzzing with activity, papers printing, lawyers rushing down hallways with heavy folders, and phones ringing nonstop. Julia, sitting in Michael's office, slowly spun in her chair, looking at the growing stack of folders beside the desk. Okay, where do I start? She asked, tucking her hair behind her ear. Michael sighed and adjusted in his chair. This case is a real challenge, Julia, and now it's in our hands. She picked a random folder, opened it, and frowned after just a few pages. Wow, there's a lot here, she said. Michael nodded, pointing to some contracts spread out on the table. This is the acquisition process for a hotel chain. It's a huge deal, and even a small mistake could cost millions. Julia bit her lip as she studied the papers before her. Her eyes scanned the words, working to absorb each detail. Michael observed her with a soft smile. Relax, take your time. You don't have to get everything right away, he said gently. Julia didn't respond, her forehead creased with concentration as she continued reading. Minutes turned into hours. She took notes, pulled out other papers, made quick remarks, and checked dates and signatures. Then, something drew her attention. Wait a second, she murmured, pulling out an older sheet. She read it, then read it again. Going back to another document, she compared the details, grabbed a highlighter, circled one point, and underlined another. Michael noticed the sudden stillness. Is everything okay? He asked. Maybe yes, maybe no, she replied, chewing on the end of her pen. This contract here, she said, lifting a paper. It's linked to the franchise agreement, right? That's correct, Michael affirmed. She quickly flipped through another document, pointing to a specific clause. So if it's linked, this doesn't make sense. Look at this. Michael stood up and walked over to her. He took the paper, and as he read it, his eyebrows slowly rose. No, that can't be, he said, pulling out another folder to compare. Julia grabbed another sheet, almost stumbling over her words. Here, look at this clause. It completely goes against what's in the main agreement. If this goes to court, the client is in trouble. Michael paused for a few seconds, then set the papers down, running a hand through his hair. Julia, this is a huge mistake. She raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms. Like the size of the Grand Canyon. More like the size of a black hole, he replied, still in shock. If the client finds out, our reputation will be ruined, and if the other side learns, it would be a disaster, she finished for him. Michael pulled out a chair, sat down, and started typing on his laptop. We need to fix this immediately. He looked at her and smiled. You just saved the case. Julia smiled back, still in disbelief. Really? He nodded. And you know what the most surprising part is? That you're going to promote me and double my salary? She joked, her laughter barely contained. No, he chuckled, that Dylan didn't catch this. His name hung in the air for a moment before Michael shook his head, still amazed. How did he miss something so simple? Maybe he was too busy with his own issues instead of looking at the contracts, Julia joked with a shrug. Hours later, the meeting room was filled with people. The client, an elegantly dressed gentleman in a gray suit, had a serious expression as he sat at the table, surrounded by assistants and directors. Dylan was there too, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, clearly unhappy. Senior partner Benson took his seat at the head of the table. "Well, gentlemen, we are here to discuss case updates," he said, looking at Michael. "Go ahead." Michael stood up, took a deep breath and spoke. After looking carefully at the contracts, they found a mistake that could have caused big problems. The client widened his eyes and asked, "Mistake? What do you mean?" Michael stayed calm and replied, "Julia, please." Everyone turned to look at Julia. She straightened her papers, took a breath, and walked to the projector. "Basically, sir," she started, showing the documents on the screen, "there's a part in the franchise agreement that goes against the acquisition contract. This means, legally, your exclusivity rights could be questioned." The client blinked in surprise. "Was this there from the beginning?" Julia pointed at the documents and answered, "Yes, and if it hadn't been fixed, your competitors could have challenged the agreement." The room fell silent. Dylan, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, kept his eyes on her. The client leaned forward and asked Michael and Julia, "Did you fix this?" Michael smiled and said, "Yes, sir. We revised the contracts, added legal protections, and adjusted the exclusivity terms." He handed the client a new folder. "Here are the updated documents." The client quickly looked through them, and his expression changed from tense to relieved, then to satisfied. "Impressive," he said to Benson. "This is excellent work." Benson smiled, happy with the compliment. "We have the best team." The client stood up and shook Michael's hand. "Congratulations on a great job." Then he turned to Julia. "What about you? Are you an intern?" Julia nodded, a bit shy. The man laughed. "If you keep this up, you'll outshine many people in this office." Dylan watched from the corner, letting out a heavy sigh. He adjusted his tie, feeling a mix of frustration and something new admiration. Benson ended the meeting with kind words and promises for future work. As everyone started to leave, Dylan walked over slowly, hands in his pockets, trying to smile. "Congratulations, intern," he said, his tone a mix of sincere and sarcastic. "So, do you want my diploma now or later?" Julia crossed her arms and looked him in the eye. "I'll take it, and I can also show you how not to lose a lawsuit." For a moment, Dylan was speechless. Then he shook his head and laughed. "You are incredible." Michael walked past them, chuckling. "Dylan, I think you just met your match." Dylan tightened his tie, thinking about how Julia had changed things for him. As he returned to his office, he couldn't wipe the smile off his face. Deep down, he knew that this intern would shake things up, and this was only the start. Dylan adjusted his tie again, feeling more nervous than stylish. He stood in front of the glass wall of his office, arms crossed, staring outside. Ever since that meeting where Julia had rescued the important contract, something inside him felt different, a mix of pride, admiration, and maybe a little fascination. He sighed to himself, "This is getting interesting." Just then he noticed Julia walking by with a determined look, carrying a folder that seemed too big for her. Dylan narrowed his eyes, thinking carefully. If he couldn't compete with her, maybe he should hire her. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and called reception. "Can you see if intern Julia can come to my office? It's not a problem." A few minutes later, there were 3 knocks on the door. "Come in," he said, fixing his hair. Julia opened the door, looking a bit unsure. "You again?" she asked, crossing her arms and raising an eyebrow. "If you're here to complain about my blazer, my shoes, or my existence, save it. I'm busy today." He smiled. "Relax, Hurricane. I'm not here to tease you. I'm making you an offer." She blinked, looking doubtful. "An offer?" Dylan stood up, walked around the desk, and sat at the edge of it, crossing his arms. "That's right. If this is about helping you pick better belts, I'm not the right person for that," she said, barely holding back a smile. "No," Dylan said, taking a deep breath. "I want you to leave Michael and come work with me." The silence in the room felt heavy. Julia blinked a few times as if trying to process what he said. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," he said, flashing his usual half-smile. "Work with me on my team." She held back a laugh, crossing her arms. "And why would I do that?" Dylan stood up and started pacing, as if he was sharing an exciting idea. "Well, let's see. With me, you'd have access to the best cases and the best opportunities." He paused, looking directly at her. "And I'll buy you coffee every day." Julia burst out laughing. "Coffee every day? Wow, what an irresistible offer. Okay, 2 coffees it is, he said, trying to keep a straight face. And you can pick the music for the office. She raised an eyebrow, pretending to think about it. Tempting, but no. He looked surprised. What do you mean, no? It's simple, she smiled. Michael treats me well, he values me, and he hasn't tried to win me over with coffee. Just then the door opened, and in walked Michael, holding a coffee mug. Did someone say my name? He asked, curious about what was happening. Dylan crossed his arms, looking serious. Just an honest attempt to take your brilliant intern, he said. Michael pretended to consider it, taking a sip of his coffee. Honest. Let me guess. You offered her coffee? 2. Dylan raised 2 fingers. And music is included. Michael laughed, shaking his head. Don't fall for it, Julia. He just wants you around to take your talent or maybe even your heart. Julia's eyes widened in surprise as she looked from Michael to Dylan, caught off guard. What? Dylan gasped, shaking his head. No way! He rubbed his face in disbelief. Come on, that's ridiculous. Michael just shrugged, clearly amused. I'm just saying what I see. Julia shook her head and placed a hand on her forehead. This is surreal. Dylan took a deep breath and looked her directly in the eye. Let's make this clear, he said, pointing at her. I only want to hire you because you're smart and good at what you do. Frustratingly good, she smiled. Wow, that was almost a compliment. Dylan crossed his arms, looking away. Michael laughed, leaning on the doorframe. Told you, the guy's totally lost. I'm not lost, Dylan replied, raising a finger. I'm just evaluating talent. Right, Michael agreed, still laughing. Your strategy is coffee and a playlist. Okay, it might sound small, Dylan said. But what if I told you, Julia, you'd get direct access to top clients and exciting cases. Plus, he added with a sly smile, your very own coffee cabinet. Julia pretended to think, pacing the room. My own coffee cabinet? She tapped her chin. With unlimited pods? Absolutely, he answered confidently. Michael shook his head, still laughing. I could try to compete, but I don't think I have that kind of charm. Julia took a deep breath, trying not to laugh. I admit it's tempting, but for now, I think I'll stick with Michael's team. Dylan stroked his chin, eyeing her. You enjoy teasing me, don't you? She crossed her arms, smiling just a little. Michael straightened up and opened the door. All right, everyone. This little professional game has been fun, but we have a contract to finish. Julia waved as she walked out. See you, Dylan. It's been interesting. Dylan put his hands in his pockets, shaking his head as he watched her leave. Interesting, yeah. I think I'm learning more than I expected. Once she disappeared down the hall, Michael looked over at Dylan, trying not to laugh. Let me give you a little advice, he started. Dylan sighed, preparing for more wisdom. If you think you're in control here, Michael said with a smile, I hate to break it to you, but you're not even close. Dylan laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, I'm starting to see that. For the first time in a long while, Dylan Carter, known for being tough and critical, realized he might have met someone who didn't just challenge his mind, but was also starting to touch his heart. The smell of fresh coffee filled the meeting room, mixed with the scent of polished wood furniture and a hint of nerves. Julia adjusted her blazer for the 3rd time, taking a deep breath. Her hands were a little sweaty, and her leg bounced anxiously. Under the table, Julia kept telling herself, breathe, Julia. It's just a meeting, just a client, just one of the toughest clients this firm has ever had. At the end of the table sat Mr. Villanova, a well-known businessman and owner of a chain of resorts. He was flipping through documents with his usual serious and focused look. Next to him, 2 assistants were typing quickly, and Dylan was there too, sitting calmly, as if it was a regular day. He glanced at Julia, smiled, and whispered, Nervous, huh? She fixed her hair and tightened her grip on her pen. Not at all. This is no big deal. Right, totally shows, he said, subtly pointing at her slightly shaking hand. Let's just hope you don't, lose your cool. Julia took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Don't worry, I'm not messing up today. Dylan tried to hide a grin but didn't say anything. Just then, managing partner Benson walked into the room and closed the door behind him. Good morning, everyone. Shall we begin? The meeting progressed with introductions, technical discussions, and contract details. Numbers were flying back and forth. Julia listened closely, taking notes and doing her best to appear completely professional. But inside, she was torn between staying focused and her growing nerves. All right then, Benson said, crossing his arms. We have the final draft of the contract here. We just need to go over the last few points. Mr. Villanova adjusted his glasses, crossed his arms, and replied in a cool, serious voice. I hope there won't be any mistakes this time. My patience is running thin. Dylan, sitting next to him, flashed a confident smile. Don't worry, everything has been checked carefully, he said. Julia shifted in her chair and pulled the folder closer. Then she noticed her coffee cup was right at the edge of the table. She should move it a bit closer, but before she could, her pen slipped from her hand and landed on the floor. In her rush to grab it, her elbow bumped the cup. In slow motion, she watched as coffee flew everywhere. Some of it landed on the table, some splashed onto the papers, and one stream hit Mr. Villanova's gray suit jacket. The room fell silent, an uncomfortable silence that felt heavy. Julia froze, staring at the coffee spreading across the table, soaking the spreadsheets and contracts along with the client's jacket. Mr. Villanova slowly looked down at his suit. Dylan's eyes widened, and for a moment he tried to hold back a laugh, but he couldn't. Oh, wow, he said, bringing his hand to his mouth. That was almost artistic. Mr. Villanova blinked, stunned, holding his breath as if he were deciding whether to shout or ask for help. Julia jumped up, grabbing napkins and trying to clean up the mess. I swear it was an accident. The cup slipped, the pen. Words tumbled out in a panic. Please don't move, Mr. Villanova said, in a voice colder than ice. Just don't touch me. Dylan coughed, trying to regain his serious demeanor but couldn't help poking fun at Julia. Are you trying to sabotage the firm, or is this a hidden talent? Julia slowly turned to him, narrowing her eyes. You're not helping. Benson, with his hand on his forehead, took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. Julia, maybe just sit down. She looked at the mess on the table, then at the client, and just wanted to vanish. I'll go get some paper towels, she said, and turned so quickly that she nearly knocked over her chair as she rushed out of the room. Dylan turned to Benson and whispered, She really takes that leave your mark thing seriously, doesn't she? Benson took a deep breath and adjusted his tie. This didn't happen. Mr. Villanova was dabbing at his jacket with a napkin, looking as if he were seriously reconsidering the entire meeting. Julia came back with rolls of paper towels, wiping the table and the soaked papers, whispering to herself, Congratulations, Julia. You've outdone yourself. Dylan stood up, picked up some documents that remained dry, and straightened them on the table. Switching to a serious tone, he looked at Mr. Villanova and said, I know this situation was unusual, to say the least. He crossed his arms and looked him straight in the eye. But honestly, I'd rather have a team that spills coffee from nerves than one that messes up contracts due to incompetence. The businessman stared in silence. Julia, unsure of where the conversation was heading, took a deep breath and said, And well, while we're talking about competence, I was looking over this contract and saw something that no one else noticed. Benson and Dylan exchanged surprised glances. She pulled out a folder, opened it, and pointed to a section. Look here, item 7B, in the second half of the year profit projection. You calculated the expected profits using the average occupancy from the past 3 years. She pointed again and continued. But that average doesn't include the last 6 months, which showed growth. This means you're underestimating your own projection by about 12.5%. Villanova frowned, took the paper, and checked it. Then he turned to his assistant, who started typing to verify the numbers. Dylan crossed his arms, holding back a surprised smile. The assistant confirmed, She's right. Villanova adjusted his glasses and looked at Julia with a new expression, one of interest instead of impatience. Impressive, he said, straightening his jacket. How long did it take you to notice that? She glanced at Dylan and then at Benson, replying, Oh, somewhere between spilling coffee and the next bit of chaos. The businessman smiled. Well, if every mess came with a solution like that, the world would be a much more efficient place. Dylan nodded with a grin. I've always said she's one of a kind. Benson took a deep breath, a mix of relief and disbelief on his face. Julia, you really... He couldn't finish his thought and just laughed. I don't know whether to promote you or keep you far from anything that spills. Villanova stood up, shaking hands with Benson, Dylan, and finally with Julia. If my team had even half your sharp eye, we'd be even wealthier, he said. She chuckled shyly. I also accept commission, just so you know. He laughed, and the meeting closed on a light note, a complete turnaround from how it had started. As everyone left, Dylan walked over, arms crossed, and looked straight at her. You know, I'm starting to think you spill things on purpose to seem more relatable. She raised an eyebrow while holding back a smile. Maybe it works, doesn't it? He laughed. It does very well. In that moment, they both realized that something was happening between them, something no contract could predict. If anyone had told Julia that after spilling coffee on a difficult client, she would leave the meeting to applause, they would have been wrong. Because now she was racing down the halls, arms full of contracts and balancing a cup of coffee. Yes, she never learns. Her phone buzzed nonstop. "Julia," Michael called as he stepped out of his office. "I need you to take these documents to the 16th floor contract office. It's urgent." "16th floor, got it," she replied, adjusting the papers. "And be careful with—" He didn't finish. "Relax, nothing is going wrong today," she interrupted as she pressed the elevator button. The elevator dinged, the doors opened, and of course Dylan was inside dressed sharply, leaning casually against the wall with a folder and that half-smile that suggested he was ready to tease her. Well, the contract destroyer," he said, raising an eyebrow while holding another cup of coffee. "You're brave." She tried to hold in a laugh as she stepped inside and said, "Yeah, some people call me fearless, while others think I'm a total mess." He replied, crossing his arms, "I'd say it's a bit of both. Where are you headed with all that paperwork? Saving the world or just handling contracts?" She smiled, adjusting her papers. "I just escaped from my meeting," he sighed. 2 hours of a client fussing over PowerPoint fonts. Her eyes widened as she tried not to laugh. Wow, that should really count as torture. The elevator began to move smoothly, and a few seconds went by in an awkward silence, filled with things left unsaid. Then, the lights flickered, a loud click echoed, and the elevator stopped. The lights dimmed to emergency mode, and they remained still between floors. Julia's eyes went wide as she looked at the panel. Nothing was lit up. No, she started pressing buttons. "Come on, anything." Dylan picked up the intercom control, but only static responded until a muffled voice finally said, "We've had an electrical failure. Some elevators are stuck. Maintenance is on the way." Dylan sighed, crossing his arms. "Great, we're stuck." Julia took a deep breath and leaned against the wall. "Okay, stay calm. This will be quick." "Of course," he said, straightening his tie. 10 to 15 minutes, max. "Unless," he added, looking up at the ceiling. "You remember last year? We were stuck for 2 hours." Julia almost spilled her coffee. "You're joking." "I wish," he replied, giving a crooked smile. "But I don't think I am." She took a deep breath, trying not to panic. "All right, it's fine. We're fine," she reassured herself, setting her papers on the floor and fixing her hair. "It's just an elevator stuck with you in it," she teased, glancing at him. "Hey." Dylan put his hand on his chest, pretending to be offended. "I'm great company." She crossed her arms and looked him straight in the eye. "That's up for debate." They stared at each other for a moment until smiles began to form on their faces slowly, as if this playful banter had become their special game. Dylan took a deep breath, leaning against the elevator rail. "You know, it's funny." "What is?" she asked, adjusting her papers on the floor. "You're the only one in this office who doesn't back down from me," he said, looking directly at her. "That's pretty rare." She blinked in surprise, feeling a mix of emotions. "And you? You're the only one who can make me nervous and laugh at the same time." He smiled. "See? I told you I'm excellent company." They both laughed, and for a brief moment the mood shifted. It wasn't just playful anymore. It felt deeper. Dylan looked up at the ceiling, crossed his arms, and took a deep breath. "You know, I'm not really like this." "Like what?" she asked, frowning. "This guy you know," he said, gazing off into space. "Always putting on a show, always building walls." She adjusted herself and sat down on the elevator floor, crossing her legs. "And why are you like that?" He took a deep breath. "My father," he said simply. "I grew up hearing that being the best was the only choice. Showing weakness meant losing." Julia stayed quiet, really listening. "So I became that guy," he continued, looking at his hand. "The guy who doesn't mess up. The guy who can't fail." She shook her head, resting her chin in her hand. "Dylan, you know that's not really living, right?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Lately, I'm starting to see that." Silence filled the air again, but this time it felt warm. Julia smiled, looking at him. "You know, behind that suit, that confident lawyer face, there's actually a pretty interesting person." He raised an eyebrow, smiling. Interesting, huh? Yeah, she replied, biting her lower lip, trying not to smile. Annoyingly interesting. Dylan moved a little closer, kneeling down to her level. And you're more than I expected. Their eyes met, and in that moment, there was no stuck elevator, no office, no contracts, just them. He leaned in slowly. She stayed still, watching as the space between them grew smaller. The silence became charged, almost electric. Then, the elevator jerked, the lights flickered, and the doors opened. They jumped, adjusting themselves as if nothing had happened. Oh yeah, it's working again, Dylan said, fixing his tie, trying to seem casual. Yeah, working, Julia replied quickly, gathering her papers, her face completely red. The security guard at the door looked at them, puzzled. Everything okay in there? All good, they both answered at the same time, practically stepping on each other's words. They walked out together, side by side, avoiding eye contact as if what almost happened hadn't occurred at all. But they both knew that from that moment on, things would be different. In the days that followed, something changed, and it wasn't just in her head, definitely not. Michael, always the keen observer, was the first to notice. All right, explain something to me, he said, arms crossed, leaning in the doorway. Since when does Mr. Most Feared Lawyer in the office help interns change the printer toner? Julia, holding a folder, tried not to laugh as she watched one of the strangest sights she'd seen in a while. Dylan crouched down, completely lost, staring at the printer as if it were a mystery. I'm not helping, Dylan replied, unsure how to fit a piece he was holding. I'm just passing through. Michael raised an eyebrow. Passing through? Right at the moment the printer broke down? Coincidence? Dylan said, fixing his tie even though his sleeves were rolled up and he had black toner ink on his finger. Julia crossed her arms, amused. And since when do you know how to change toner? Dylan held up the piece, looked at her, then at the printer and said, Since now. Michael tried not to laugh. I'm an astronaut in my spare time. Dylan sighed, standing up and brushing off his hands, making more ink spread on his suit jacket. Okay, fine. Printers aren't really my thing. Julia hugged a folder to her chest, biting her lip to hold back a laugh. What exactly were you trying to do? She asked. Dylan crossed his arms and looked away. Just seeing if you needed anything. Michael grabbed the doorframe, pretending to think. Right, and this whole seeing if she needs anything thing happens 3 times an hour? Coincidences? Dylan responded while adjusting his tie for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. The world is full of them. Michael acted like he was taking notes on his phone. Uh-huh. I'm starting a spreadsheet called Dylan's Coincidences. Julia tried to stay serious and took a deep breath. Guys, seriously, the two of you are something else. This feels like a comedy scene. Dylan adjusted his blazer, cleared his throat, and pointed at the printer. And just for the record, this printer clearly has something personal against me. Michael laughed. Or maybe it just doesn't want to be part of your plan. Dylan shot back with an eyebrow raised. What plan? Michael shrugged and smiled. You know, that little plan of yours to keep circling around here like Julia's personal satellite. Julia's eyes widened. Excuse me? She looked from Michael to Dylan, shocked and unsure if she should laugh or just walk away. Dylan crossed his arms and straightened up, answering with a cheeky grin. That's pure imagination on your part. Michael crossed his arms too. Of course, just my imagination. You never show up out of nowhere, never suddenly appear in the file room for no reason. He mimicked Dylan's voice, saying, Do you need anything? I'm helpful, Dylan replied with a grin. Unlike some people who like making up wild theories. Julia shook her head, trying not to laugh. Okay, this is getting too entertaining. Meanwhile, the printer remained broken. Dylan looked at it like it was the cause of all this awkwardness. All right, Mr. Printer, you're officially fired. Michael leaned against the wall, struggling not to laugh. Oh boy, are you going to sue the printer now? No, but I'm considering it. Julia took a deep breath, crouched down, opened the printer side, and with 2 quick moves, replaced the old cartridge with a new one. She pressed a couple of buttons, and the printer started working again. All done, she said, standing up and wiping her hands. Just unlock this part here, and there you go. Dylan stood there for a few seconds in silence, staring at the machine. That's it? He asked. That's it, Julia answered with a mysterious smile. No PhD in mechanical engineering required, Michael pretended to applaud. Round of applause for Julia and even bigger applause for Dylan for his effort. Thank you very much, Dylan replied, crossing his arms and pretending to be offended. Him feeling extremely appreciated, Julia gathered her papers as the printer finally started spitting them out. Now that the save of the printer mission is complete, I guess I can get back to work, right? Dylan adjusted his suit jacket, discreetly wiping off the last bit of ink from his hand. Of course, I was just stopping by to... He paused, checking to see if everything was okay. Michael laughed and shook his head. Yeah, Dylan, that's pretty obvious. Obvious to who? Dylan shot back, raising an eyebrow. Michael pointed to Julia and the intern who just ran past the door. Probably to the printer, too. Julia tried hard not to laugh. You two are a whole show by yourselves, she said. Dylan took a deep breath, crossed his arms, and looked away. I'm not jealous, okay? He replied. Michael raised an eyebrow and smiled. No one said anything about jealousy, Dylan. Julia's eyes widened as she tried to hold back her laughter. Yeah, nobody mentioned it. Dylan realized too late what he had just said. He ran a hand over his face and shook his head. This was not ideal. Michael laughed, crossing his arms. Oh, it happened, and I'm keeping this in my memory. Dylan straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. Well then, it's been a pleasure, folks. He pointed toward the door. I have very important things to do. Michael blinked, checking if Julia needed anything else as Dylan opened the door and gave her a sideways look before leaving. Julia stood there, staring at the open door. Guys, he's not even trying to hide it anymore, is he? Michael took a deep breath, shaking his head with a smile. No, Julia, he's not. And honestly, this is getting more interesting by the minute. The sound of Julia's heels echoed through the hallway. Excited chatter filled the office. It felt different. People were whispering and exchanging glances. Wherever she walked, knowing smiles appeared, as if everyone knew something she didn't. She quickened her pace, holding a stack of documents, eyeing everyone suspiciously. Okay, what's going on? She whispered, adjusting her blazer. It's like there's a secret about my own life, and no one bothered to tell me. In the main conference room, senior partner Benson was organizing papers while the partners, attorneys, and interns began filling the seats. A huge screen displayed the quarterly performance report with charts and one big highlight, Employee of the Month Julia Mendez. Dylan, sitting at the end of the table, crossed his arms, trying to hide a smile that appeared every time her name was mentioned. Michael, sitting next to him, adjusted his tie and looked at the slide. This is not common, he remarked, frowning. Not at all, Dylan replied, straightening his shirt sleeve. But I think it's well-deserved. Well, look who's become a fan, Michael said, barely holding back a smile. Dylan pretended not to hear, but the smirk on his face said it all. Benson cleared his throat and stood up. Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. He pointed at the screen. As you know, this last quarter was very challenging, but thanks to everyone's hard work, we achieved impressive results. The room filled with applause. Benson continued, and a few names really stood out during this time. He paused dramatically, glancing at Julia, who sat in the back with wide eyes, clearly confused about what was happening. To our surprise, our top highlight is someone who, despite being an intern, showed dedication and skill that impressed us all. Julia's eyes widened even more. No, she whispered to herself, sinking into her chair. This is not happening. Benson smiled. Julia Mendez, please stand up. The whole office turned toward her. Applause erupted. Some clapped politely while others cheered. Michael smiled and clapped, while Dylan clapped like everyone else. However, the way he looked at her showed a mix of pride and admiration, along with a hint of concern. Julia stood up, feeling very embarrassed, her cheeks turning red. Oh no, you really don't have to, she said, but Benson continued. Julia not only helped save important documents, but also found mistakes and did analyses that even the experienced attorneys missed. He looked right at Dylan, mentioning that she played a crucial role in over 3 important cases. Dylan stared at the ceiling for a moment, taking a deep breath as if thinking, great, now it's time to make it worse. Benson wrapped up by saying, for that, we are very pleased with your work. We hope to see you here for a long time. Another round of applause followed. Julia gave a shy little wave, biting her lip and tucking her hair behind her ear as she shrank down in her chair, thinking, I just want to disappear. When the meeting ended, the office turned into a social gathering. Everyone wanted to congratulate Julia, joking around and making comments like, wow, someone is famous now. Watch out, you might become a partner soon. Time to talk about that salary. What she didn't realize was that the boldest comment was still to come. Amid the cheerful buzz, Dylan appeared, dressed sharply with his signature half-smile and hands in his pockets. He stopped in front of her, looked her in the eye and said, All right, I think it's time to make this official. She frowned, asking, make what official? He took a deep breath and crossed his arms. Work with me directly. Leave Michael's team and join mine. Silence fell over the room. If there had been chatter before, now all eyes were on them. Michael, who had been walking over with a coffee, stopped in his tracks, blinking in surprise. He looked from his coffee to the scene before him and muttered to himself, I knew it. Julia blinked a few times, trying to grasp if this was real. Wait, are you serious? Dylan nodded firmly, serious as ever. Noticing everyone watching, he added with a slight shrug, Yeah, I'm officially making you an offer. Michael crossed his arms, smiling slyly. Oh, so that's how it is now taking someone from my team. Dylan grinned. I prefer to call it redistributing talent. Julia hugged her folder closely, looking back and forth between them. You guys, this is unreal. Michael stepped closer, standing by her side. Just be careful, Julia. Dylan just wants to keep you close. At that moment, laughter and whispers filled the office as everyone chimed in with, ooh. Dylan took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and said, Michael, please. Then he looked directly at Julia and added, Don't listen to him. My offer is serious. I want you on my team with a full salary, bonuses, and your own coffee drawer. She tried not to laugh, crossing her arms. Wow, this got serious quickly. Michael jumped in, smiling. And if you join my team, we'll double the coffee supply. Plus, I'll add a comfy chair. Dylan blinked and replied, I have a comfy chair too. Mine even has a massage function. Michael laughed back, trying to hold in his amusement, and the whole office burst into laughter. People pretended to work, but really, everyone was watching what felt like a live comedy show. Julia took a breath, crossed her arms, and looked from Dylan to Michael. Wow, so this is a competition now. Dylan smiled and put his hands in his pockets. And just so you know, I like to win. Michael offered his hand and replied, We'll see, Carter. Julia shook her head, holding back a smile. Okay, let me think. This feels more like an auction than a job offer. Dylan smiled back and said, Take your time. And just to be clear, no one on my team gets stuck in elevators anymore. Michael couldn't help himself and added, And on my team, the printer never jams. Everyone laughed again, and Julia joined in, shaking her head. You two are impossible. But deep down, she realized this was about something bigger than just work, contracts, coffee, or printers. After what became a famous event known as the intern auction, the office seemed more interested in this lighthearted rivalry than their actual work. Dylan, however, felt a bit out of place since the public showdown with Michael. He was unsure how to act. In the last few hours, he had done things he never thought he would, like buying 2 coffees instead of 1 and bringing one straight to Julia's desk. Here, he said, placing the cup on her desk. I thought you might want this. Julia looked up with surprise. You brought me coffee? He adjusted his tie and tried to sound casual. Well, not exactly. I stopped by the cafe and they gave me 2 by mistake. He scratched the back of his neck, feeling awkward. So I had one left over. She tried not to laugh. And did they happen to write my name on it? She held up the cup, which had Julia written on it. Dylan turned red. Coincidences happen. She smiled, shaking her head. You're getting pretty good at this, you know. He crossed his arms and looked away. At what? At pretending you're not trying to get my attention. He opened his mouth, then closed it, crossed his arms again, took a deep breath and said, I'm not okay, maybe a little. Julia rested her chin on her hand, looking straight at him. You're a bit lost, aren't you? He sighed and shook his head. And you enjoy it, don't you? She smiled. A lot. Dylan rubbed his face with frustration, torn between walking away or staying. To his surprise, he decided to stay. Okay, look, he said, pulling up a chair and sitting next to her. I'm not good at this. At what? She teased. Talking. Talking to me? She asked as she sorted through her papers. Yes, he admitted, taking a breath. Because you throw me off balance. There was a moment of silence. Julia blinked, a bit surprised, as if trying to process what he had just said. Wow, she finally said, resting her chin on her hand. That was almost a confession. Dylan rubbed his face again. It wasn't, not exactly. Julia tried not to laugh. Right, not exactly. He moved his arms and said, Okay, you really throw me off. I don't know how to act or what to say. He looked at her closely and added, You know what you're doing to me, right? She smiled playfully and replied, I'm starting to figure it out. Dylan shook his head and chuckled, even though he tried not to. This is totally crazy. I'm one of the most respected lawyers here. I've handled big contracts and faced tough judges, and now... He pointed at her and continued, I can't even finish a sentence when you look at me like that. She raised an eyebrow and rested her chin on her hand. He took a deep breath and looked right at her as he said, You're the one in charge here. She smiled and crossed her arms, asking, Am I not? Dylan broke into a wide grin and shook his head. You definitely are. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other without any jokes or sarcasm. There was an unspoken question in the air. So now what? He took a deep breath, stood up, adjusted his tie, and suddenly said, I like you. Okay, complete silence. He froze, and she did too. The whole world felt still. Wait, what? She said, her eyes wide. Say that again. He ran a hand over his face and closed his eyes tightly. No, that wasn't how I meant to say it. He took a deep breath and pointed at her. You make me feel completely... He waved his hand, searching for the right word. Off balance. She hugged the folder to her chest, trying to hold back a laugh in her racing heart. Wow, was that a confession or a mistake? He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck, unsure about where to look. Maybe a little of both. She smiled warmly. So, you like me, is that it? Dylan put his hands in his pockets and nodded, smiling. Yeah, that's it. And I like you too. The silence that followed was comfortable and full of meaning, something that words couldn't fully describe. Julia crossed her arms, looking at him with a smile that only she could pull off. Well, it was about time, wasn't it? He raised an eyebrow. Time? She stood up, took a sip of the coffee he had brought her, and grinned. Because I like you too, Dylan. He blinked in surprise. Okay, now I'm speechless. She laughed and adjusted her bag strap. Welcome to my world. Dylan smiled, shaking his head and crossing his arms. This is really happening, right? She took 2 steps closer, stood on tiptoe, and looked straight into his eyes. It is, counselor. He said, almost breathless. She smiled. You're quite charming when you're flustered. He laughed and shook his head. You are impossible. And you just fell for it, she said, winking playfully. As they walked out of the room side by side, laughing and teasing each other, one thing became clear to both of them. Amid lawsuits, contracts, and printers that kept breaking, something much bigger was starting. If someone had told Julia on her first day in that office that she would one day be walking with Dylan Carter, not just as colleagues but as partners, she probably would have laughed loudly. But here she was, her ID badge swinging, folders in hand, heels clicking down the hallway with Dylan beside her. They talked nonstop about deadlines, clauses, and hearings, sneaking glances and smiles that they could no longer hide. Okay, Dylan said, adjusting his tie and looking at her. So just to be clear, you officially agreed to work with me. She tried to hold back her laughter. Yes, official, he said with a smirk, crossing his arms and stepping back. No more thinking about it. Maybe or we'll see. Yes, Carter, she replied, amused. I am officially your assistant. He smiled widely, looking proud. And you're not regretting it? She pretended to think. Not yet, but the day is just getting started. He laughed and shook his head. You're impossible. Julia winked as she gathered her folders. You just fell for it. But before they could continue their playful banter, Benson appeared at the door, holding a red folder. U2 conference room, he said. They shared quick glances, raised their eyebrows, and followed him into the room. Benson placed the folder on the table and said without any small talk, We have a big case and it's urgent. Dylan focused, crossing his arms. Let's hear it. The Hernandez Real Estate Group, Benson began, is suing our client for breach of contract and asking for a huge amount in damages. Julia pulled out a chair and opened the folder. Wow, this is serious. Benson nodded. You two are taking it. Dylan raised an eyebrow. The two of us? Yes, he confirmed. The client requested you both. Dylan and Julia exchanged looks, momentarily forgetting they were in a serious meeting. Dylan adjusted his tie. Let's go win this, Benson smiled. That's what I wanted to hear. As they left the office, the courthouse steps were filled with lawyers, clients, and reporters, all moving in different directions. Dylan and Julia climbed the stairs side by side. He adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time, and she tightly held the folder, as if it were her shield against nerves. Nervous? He asked, glancing at her. Me? She took a deep breath. Just a little. He tried not to smile. Well, if it helps, I am too. Her eyes went wide. Really? He grinned. Seriously, but don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain. They entered the courtroom where the judge was already seated and the opposing attorneys were getting their documents ready. Let's go, Dylan said, opening his folder and focusing fully. But of course, things never go as planned. When he stood up to hand a document to the judge, he tripped over his shoelace. Everything felt slow as he stumbled, knocking into a chair and a file cart but missing the judge by just a small margin. For heaven's sake, the judge exclaimed, his eyes wide. Are you all right, Mr. Carter? Dylan straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and replied with as much dignity as he could manage. Perfectly fine, Your Honor. Just testing the furniture's durability. Julia, sitting at the assistant's table, nearly choked, trying hard not to laugh, while the opposing attorney whispered something to his assistant, both struggling to keep straight faces. The judge shook his head, adjusted his glasses, and said, Very well, let's proceed carefully. Dylan took a deep breath, adjusted his folder, and glanced at Julia, who was trying not to laugh. He muttered, Not one word. She bit her lip and nodded, Not a word. Even with little mishaps, they performed flawlessly sharp arguments, solid defense, quick thinking, and teamwork that felt built over years. When Julia stood to present a clause analysis, the judge adjusted his glasses, clearly impressed. When Dylan countered an opposing argument with quick reasoning, two of the other attorneys exchanged uneasy looks. The victory felt closer. After 3 hours of debate, questioning, and back and forth, the judge brought down the gavel. This court rules in favor of the defense. Case closed. Their client jumped up with excitement, and Dylan and Julia exchanged a look that spoke volumes of their accomplishment. They shared a quick fist bump, a small gesture that meant a lot. We did it, she said with a smile. We did, he replied, giving her a wink. They walked out of the courtroom together, feeling proud. But as they reached the hallway, Dylan stopped. Julia? He asked, gently holding her arm. She looked at him, curious. What? She replied. Taking a deep breath, he said, I'm not going to wait anymore. Wait for what? She questioned. But before she could finish, he wrapped his arms around her waist. This? He asked. And they shared a kiss right there in the courthouse hallway. They were surrounded by passing lawyers, clients, security guards, and a few co-workers who seemed to be watching discreetly. I knew it, whispered Michael, likely recording the moment on his phone. I knew it, said one of the assistants, placing a hand over her heart as if watching a romantic scene. The kiss felt like magic, making everything else fade away. It was just them, and that moment, filled with feelings that had been held back for too long. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling with warmth on their cheeks. Wow, she whispered, biting her lower lip. That was... Yeah, he smiled back. It was... From behind the column, Michael chimed in. Okay, someone hand me a tissue. This is cuter than my favorite movie. The whole office erupted in applause, laughter, and cheers. Some even clapped right there in the courthouse. Dylan, with a charming grin, looked at Julia and said softly, This was officially the best victory of my life. She squeezed his hand and smiled, knowing she would never cancel this agreement. Deep down, they both understood it was more than just a case in the courtroom. It was a connection from the heart. After their famous kiss, Julia and Dylan's lives were not what anyone would call normal. But then again, normal never really fit them. Officially, they were together, but it felt like the entire office cared more about their relationship than their actual work. The next morning when Julia arrived, she found a note taped to the break room door. It read that it was officially forbidden to root against the couple. Maybe it was from management, or maybe just some office gossip. She laughed and shook her head as she entered the building. And there he was, Dylan Carter, looking sharp in his suit, leaning casually against the break room counter and holding 2 coffees. Good morning, intern, he said with a smile. Julia crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. Morning, attorney. At this point, you might need to come up with a new nickname for me. He pretended to think, looking at her thoughtfully. Maybe future Mrs. Carter, he said with a smile. She raised her eyebrows, trying not to laugh. Easy there, counselor. Don't you think that's a bit much? He shrugged and handed her a coffee. Hey, you never know. Just then, Michael walked by, holding a folder and giving them a classic look that said he was ready to tease. Good luck, Julia, he said without slowing down. Your biggest case now is living with that guy. Dylan turned to him, pointing playfully. Objection, Your Honor. Michael laughed and kept walking, saying it was overruled. Julia shook her head with a smile. He never missed a chance to joke. Dylan took a deep breath and crossed his arms. To be fair, he's not wrong. I can be a handful. She stepped closer, holding her coffee. Guess what? I love a challenge, she replied, and he winked, saying, I know that's why you chose me. The days that followed were filled with affection, playful teasing, and many curious looks from their coworkers. So, Julia, how's it going working with your personal boss? The receptionist paused, searching for the word. Intense, Julia answered, holding back a laugh. But fun. Dylan, overhearing from across the room, crossed his arms and chimed in. And extremely competent, by the way. The whole office erupted in laughter. They worked together like two sides of the same coin, perfect together at the office, but a bit chaotic outside of work. There was constant teasing, exchanged glances, shared coffees, and sometimes files would mysteriously disappear from her desk, making her have to walk over to his office. Just a coincidence, of course. What Julia didn't know was that Dylan had been planning something special. That afternoon, while she was finishing up a contract review, he appeared at her door holding a folder. Hey, he said, with that familiar smile that meant something exciting was coming. She raised an eyebrow. What is it? He waved a folder. Got a contract for you to look over. Now? She frowned. But we finished everything. This one is special, he said, placing the folder on her desk. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single page on the company's letterhead, titled Lifetime Partnership Agreement. As she began to read, she held back a laugh. Clause 1. The parties, Dylan Carter and Julia Mendez, agreed to a lifetime partnership based on love, laughter, support, and shared coffee. Clause 2. Dylan commits to providing daily coffee, hugs, and loving gazes. He also agrees to share Friday night pizza, even when he really wants it all for himself. Clause 3. Julia agrees to remain the whirlwind that brightened Dylan's life, and of course to be his personal attorney, partner, and the love of his life forever. She looked up, speechless. Dylan opened the folder again and took out a small, classic black ring box. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring, just like them. He got down on one knee in the middle of the office. Julia, would you be my personal attorney for the rest of my life? Silence filled the room. Everyone held their breath, and Michael in the corner was clearly recording the whole thing. Julia laughed, covering her face with her hands, and playfully said, Objection. She paused for effect. Sustained. The office erupted with cheers, whistles, and applause. Michael shouted from the back, Somebody get the champagne. Dylan slid the ring on her finger, stood up, and pulled her into his arms. Yes, there was another kiss, full of smiles, as they were surrounded by applause. The wedding day arrived, looking like a scene from a movie. An outdoor garden with beautiful lights, white flowers, and golden details. A sign at the entrance read, Welcome to the most important contract of Dylan and Julia's life. Michael officiated and did not miss his chance to say, Julia, good luck. Your biggest case is living with this stubborn lawyer who is completely in love with you. Everyone laughed, wiping away tears. When Dylan looked into her eyes and held her hands, his voice was softer and more sincere than any vows he had ever made. Julia, you came into my life like a whirlwind. You turned everything upside down, my office, my heart, and my life has never been the same. I love you, and if you'll have me, I want it to be forever. She wiped away a tear, smiled, and replied, Dylan, you were that stubborn lawyer I swore I'd never tolerate, and now you're the love of my life. I love you, and yes, forever. The I do was followed by applause, tears, smiles, and that perfect movie-ending kiss. The reception was just their style fun, filled with jokes, silly dances, favorite songs, and of course coffee on every table with little signs that read, Official toast of this contract, coffee plus love. And right there on the dance floor, swaying awkwardly and laughing, they knew that in the end, the most important case of their lives would always be loving each other. Unlike any other contract, this one had no expiration date. What did you think of Julia and Dylan's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one of our stories. Stick around to watch more heartfelt tales.